If you're in a rough situation and you start pining for the tyranny and calling yourself a victim and bitching about everything and losing your faith in forward movement, things are going to get a hell of a lot worse. William James, the American philosopher, said that we needed a moral equivalent to war, because war calls people to extremes, right? To the extremes in their life. And there's something about that was obviously compelling, as you say. It's uncomfortable as well to state that blatantly, because obviously peace is a desirable condition. But the question is then, well, how do you put sufficient adventure into the peace? And that's a very complicated problem. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. In any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted, but that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. If you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over, because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens, or it recedes and broadens, and otherwise you'd run out of things to do. You're adventurous, you want to make a mark, is you bloody well better learn how to write. Because if you learn how to write, well, then you can think and you can communicate your thoughts. So not only are you deadly strategically, you become extremely convincing. And then you can go and do anything you want and no one will stop you. And that's never told to people. And I don't really understand why. You know, you hear the pen is mightier than the sword, which is just a cliche unless it's fleshed out. There are lots of young people, we'll talk about young men for a moment, who feel lost. It's like, where am I going to find the meaning in my life? And if you can let people know that one of the deepest possible sources of meaning that you can tap, that's more or less it's unfathomable, right? It never stops giving, is the meaning that comes as a consequence of working on behalf of the appropriate development of other people. When I went on tour the first time, I bought some very expensive suits. And I thought, I'd always dressed formally when I was a professor, compared to most professors anyways. Not as formally as I dress now, but in that vein. And when I went on tour, I thought, well, I'm going to put some real effort into this, right? Because, well, I'm going to talk to 350,000 people, and like, let's not take that for granted, even a little bit. We're going to put everything we have behind this and make sure it works. So I bought these suits, and then people started showing up at the shows in suits, like 40% of the audience. Well, and all these young guys come and they tell me often, oh, it's the first suit I've ever bought. And they're standing up and they look like men instead of like 10-year-olds that have been inflated with a bicycle pump. And so
it's good.
I mean, it's a tenet of clinical psychotherapy that a voluntary approach to what's frightening, threatening, even disgusting is curative. It has to be voluntary. And it can't be too intense, right? Because if it gets too intense, it can actually hurt you. But if it's voluntary and measured, that actually seems to strengthen people. It develops resilience. And I would say that's one thing that virtually all well-trained clinicians agree on, is that kind of exposure, whether it's discussing old, difficult experiences in an autobiographical manner, or whether it's actually going out into the world and facing things that you're afraid of. If you're an elevator phobic, for example, you might be faced with, confronted with the necessity of at least looking at an elevator, which is something you might avoid if you're phobic. And then, so that's the first thing. So there is some pronounced human tendency to be attracted to what's dark, because that is a pathway to mental and physical resilience. And then the second thing is, which I also think is extremely important, is it's useful to cultivate gratitude, in my estimation. And one of the ways that you can do that, because you take a lot of what's good in your life for granted. It gets invisible, especially if it's predictable. It gets invisible, and that's unfortunate because it's still rare and precious. And if you know how terrible things can be, have been, or could become, then that can alert you to how fortunate you are when all hell isn't breaking loose right now everywhere in your life. If you're made self-conscious by one of your inadequacies, you want to remove the inadequacy. You don't want to remove the self-consciousness. But it can get out of hand too. People can be so self-conscious and so self-critical that they can't move forward. So it can definitely be, you can have too much of that, that's for sure. And it's one of the things you do as a behavior therapist, again, a cognitive behavior therapist, is if you have someone who's particularly self-conscious, there'll be a litany in their head of all of their inadequacies. And so it's like they have an inner tormentor that just constantly natters at them about how useless and weak and inadequate they are. And there's a lot of stock arguments that repeat. And one of the things you do with someone who is in that situation is you have them write down all their self-critical thoughts, and you do that dialectically. You help them over many sessions make a complete account, and then you help them develop counter-arguments. Not false counter-arguments, but you go after it. It's like, well, is that really true? And here's the evidence that it's not. And so you can bolster people against the consequences of self-consciousness gone amok. And that's often quite effective. The question, what do you want? That's a really deep question. That's a serious question. What is it that you should value? And people say, well, being happy. They don't even mean that, by the way. If you decompose what people mean when they say they want to be happy, what it turns out they actually mean is they don't want to be miserable. They're way more concerned with avoiding suffering than they are with pursuing, enthusiastic, positive emotion. So even the statement, I want to be happy, is actually not an accurate reflection of what it is that you want. You don't have it. You don't have that many opportunities. It's the same when you're formulating relationships in your adolescence, late adolescence, and early adulthood. You don't have that many experiments to run. And you get old a lot faster than you think. So attention is an underrated faculty. People don't really repress the things they don't want to face. They just fail to unpack them. Like maybe you're on YouTube regularly, and every time you shut the computer off, you feel somewhat disgusted. But you don't pay any attention to that for a while, for 2 years. But then you decide you're going to pay attention. And then you find out, well, the reason you're disgusted is because you're wasting your life and you know it. And that disgust is indicating that. But unless you attend to the disgust and unpack it, let it reveal itself as informative, you don't know what the message is. You just have a sense of disquiet. It's not easy to transform that sense of disquiet into an actionable plan. And often you have to talk to someone about it as well. You have to discover. So it's not like you're repressing the emotion exactly. It's that you don't undergo the difficult process necessary to unpack it.